Hello, students. Good day to all of you. So, today's topic with respect to the head and neck, we are actually starting with the pharynx. So, in the first part of this pharynx lecture, we will be discussing mainly about the general features of the pharynx, followed by that the first two subdivisions of the pharynx, that is the nasopharynx and the oropharynx. Our learning objectives for today will be mainly on a short introduction about the pharynx, followed by that the situation, extent and relations of the pharynx as a whole. Then we will discuss about the specific features of the nasopharynx. Then followed by that we will also discuss about the specific features of the oropharynx, and in that we will also see in detail about the palatine tonsils. Now, first of all, what is actually a pharynx? Now, pharynx, we all have discussed that pharynx is also present in the lower forms. So you would have come across the term pharynx in your school days itself. Now, pharynx simply refers to the gut. Okay, in humans, it is the cranial part of the gut or the gastrointestinal tract. Okay, so it is mainly primitively developed from the foregut. Okay, so our primitive gut is actually divided into foregut. Then you have the midgut and finally the hindgut. So the foregut gives rise to your pharynx, esophagus, stomach, and part of your duodenum. Your other structures developed from the foregut are your liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. So the liver, gallbladder, and pancreas is exactly developed at the junction of the foregut and the midgut. Now, so this primitive gut, what happens is it gives rise. It is mainly an endodermal derivative. So it mainly gives rise to your inner part. So that is your mucous membrane and your epithelial lining of the gut. Now this has to be surrounded by a muscle. Okay, so which is reinforced by muscles. That is the whole of your GAT. You have inner circular and outer longitudinal muscles. So this is mainly derived from your intra-embryonic mesoderm. Okay, so here you are able to see in the section mainly the mesoderm, which is on either side of the notochord, will be your paraxial, and then you have intermediate. The lateral plate mesoderm will actually divide into, here you are able to see the somatopleuric and the splanchnopluric. So now when the yolk sac is actually absorbed inside your body during the lateral folding of the embryo, okay, so during the lateral folding of the embryo, what happens is this splanchnopluric mesoderm surrounds your primitive gut and forms your the muscular layer. So it is actually called as the muscularis externa. And your somatopleuric mainly forms your body wall muscles. Okay, so mainly your anterolateral body wall muscles such as your intercostal muscles, your external oblique muscles. Okay, so in adults only after this development it is represented as a musculomembranous tube. So that muscular part only in pharynx we call it as the constrictor muscles of the pharynx, and also you have some longitudinal muscles of the pharynx, okay, which are primitively from your inner longitudinal, inner circular and outer longitudinal, which is slightly disposed or transposed in a different way. So pharynx mainly represents your cranial part of the gut. Okay, so the upper part of the gut, which is somewhat wide, and as you go down, it narrows mainly at the esophagus. So uh, that is the pharyngoesophageal junction. Okay, pharyngoesophageal junction. So here you are able to see it is actually extending from the base of the skull. Okay, so as I told you, it is a muscular tube which is lined by membrane and also contains your mucous membrane. To tell the mucous membrane, other membranes are also there, so we will come to it later. Okay, so it is wide in the upper part as you are able to see, and it narrows down, and where it actually continues as the esophagus. Okay, so the upper part is not only wide, and even though it is actually a derivative of the part of the gastrointestinal tract, it behaves more of a nasal cavity or respiratory passage. And here again, you should remember that your respiratory passage is again a offshoot from the foregut, because the foregut only what happens is a septum divides, tracheoesophageal septum divides, and the anterior part only forms the trachea, and that dichotomously divides to form your bronchi, primary, tertiary, secondary, and tertiary bronchi, and so on. Okay, so with this short introduction, we will directly pass on to the extent and situation of the pharynx. So when you look at this muscular tube, so that is the posterior aspect of the muscular tube which you are viewing, posterior view, which is extending from the base of the skull and continues down as the esophagus. And that is the lateral wall again, which is also muscular. Okay, but anteriorly what happens is it is open and communicates with the various cavities. So from the base of skull up to the sixth cervical vertebra, so that is the pharyngoesophageal junction where the pharynx continues as the esophagus. It is at the same level the larynx also continues as the trachea. So its extension is from the base of the skull to the C6 vertebra. So it is situated mainly behind the oral cavity, nasal cavity. Starting from above, it is behind the nasal cavity. That is why it is called as the nasopharynx. And the one which is situated behind the oral cavity is called as the oropharynx. And one behind the larynx, you cannot call it as laryngeal cavity. One behind the larynx is actually called as the laryngopharynx. So everything is actually a continuous tube. Only thing we have subdivided into oropharynx, nasopharynx, and laryngopharynx for our better understanding and interpretation of the structures. Okay, so anteriorly it communicates with the nasopharynx above. Then here it communicates with the oral cavity, and more below it communicates with the larynx, mainly through the inlet of larynx. Because what happens is this opening or communication between the inlet of the larynx and the laryngopharynx is only at rest. That is when the constrictors or the other muscles of the pharynx are not acting. So when actually these constrictors are the muscles, they act only during deglutition or swallowing. Okay, so during swallowing, definitely what happens is this communication is completely shut off from the pharynx. Okay, the communication is completely shut off. So this is very, very important. Otherwise, whatever you are swallowing, whether it is food or water, what happens is it might actually enter into the larynx and then into your trachea. So that might produce obstruction. Okay, so that is very, very important. Next, coming to the relations of the pharynx. uh, in front, as I told you, it communicates with the nasal cavity, oral cavity, and then your laryngeal inlet. It communicates with the laryngeal cavity through the laryngeal inlet. So behind it is supported by the first six vertebra, that is C1 to C6. So totally there are actually seven cervical vertebra of the upper six vertebra, and of course the intervertebral discs, and in front you have the anterior longitudinal ligament, and then you have the muscles. So that is the paravertebral muscles, and they are covered by a fascia, the paravertebral fascia, and in front of it you have a space, a narrow space between the posterior wall of the pharynx and this vertebra and the vertebral muscles, and that space is actually called as the retropharyngeal space. Okay, since it is present behind the pharynx, it is called as the retropharyngeal space, forms your posterior relation of the pharynx. So the retropharyngeal space, this space is definitely necessary because during the deglutition process, the pharynx has to constrict, and not only that, when the bolus of food passes, the pharynx actually it has to expand, okay, inflate, okay, to some extent, and then it has to constrict. So it has to freely slide over these vertebrae and the vertebral muscles. So that space is necessary. So retropharyngeal space, we will discuss that retropharyngeal space and the muscles of the pharynx in the second part of the lecture. So above it is supported by the base of skull, mainly by the inferior surface of the body of the sphenoid, and then the basilar part of occipital bone, which is called as the basi-occiput. So that forms the roof of the pharynx mainly. So there is no floor of the pharynx because below it is open and communicates with the esophagus. So it is continuous with the esophagus at the level of the sixth cervical vertebra. So it is then. So at the sides it is related. So we have seen the superior roof, then below it continues, and anterior and posteriorly you are able to see the retropharyngeal space. Here mainly you have the loose areolar tissue with some lymph nodes, and then you see the ramification of the vessels and nerves. So pharyngeal vessels and nerves on this retropharyngeal space. On either side, it is mainly related to the styloid process and the structures attached to the styloid process, which is called collectively as the styloid apparatus. So mainly it consists of the three muscles, stylopharyngeus, styloglossus, stylohyoid, and two ligaments, that is the stylohyoid ligament and the stylomandibular ligament. So upper part they form these relations. Then you also have the lateral lobes of the thyroid gland. So if you remember the relations of the thyroid gland, each lobe, the medial relations, we discuss it: two tubes, two nerves, and two muscles. So the two tubes are the pharynx behind and the trachea in front. So the two nerves are the recurrent laryngeal nerve, okay, and the external laryngeal nerve, and the two muscles are mainly your cricothyroid muscle and the inferior constrictor muscle of the pharynx. So that is how the thyroid is actually forming the lateral relation for the pharynx, and then you have the carotid sheath with the contents. So mainly the internal carotid artery forms the lateral relation of the larynx. So with this introduction about the larynx as a whole, its situation, its relations and extent, we will pass on to the interior of the larynx. So first we will be discussing about the nasopharynx. So the nasopharynx is situated behind the nasal cavity. So anteriorly it communicates with the nasal cavity through the posterior nasal aperture, or also called as the cone. Okay, so it communicates anteriorly with the nasal cavity through the posterior nasal aperture or the cone. So in front, as I told you, that is the communication, and behind it is supported mainly by the first cervical vertebra, the arch of the atlas, and the posterior sloping surface of the basi occiput. So that will be the posterior relation. Superiorly, it actually forms the roof of the pharynx, and mainly you have a sloping roof which slopes downwards and backwards. So mainly formed by the lower surface of the body of the sphenoid. You have the sphenoidal sinus within the body, and then the basi occiput. So that forms the roof, and it is continuous with the posterior wall. So the lower part of the basi occiput and the anterior arch of the atlas mainly forms the posterior wall. Okay, so that is the roof and the posterior wall and the anterior wall, which we have seen it is communicating. Now below it communicates with the oropharynx. So it is communicates with the oropharynx through a narrow part which is called as the isthmus, or the narrow nasopharyngeal isthmus. So this communication, this isthmus is actually shut or closed off during the deglutition, because the food should not enter into the nasopharynx. It should not go above. Okay, now this part of the pharynx behaves more like a respiratory passage. So it can be considered as the upper respiratory tract, and the lining epithelium is again the respiratory epithelium, that is the ciliated columnar epithelium. Okay, so it is more of a respiratory tract, and it transmits only air. The nasopharynx transmits only the air. So now what are the other features which you come across? This nasopharynx, mainly on the roof, you will come across a collection of lymphoid tissue, which is actually called as the nasopharyngeal tonsil. So aggregation of lymphoid tissue, which is actually called as the nasopharyngeal tonsil, is seen on the roof of the nasopharynx, deep to the mucous membrane. It is seen deep to the mucous membrane, the submucous level. So this is not very prominent in adults. So that is why in this picture you don't see it very conspicuously. But in children, it is very conspicuous, and when it is enlarged, it is called as the adenoids. When it is inflamed, so that is actually called as the adenoids. So I will come to that in the clinical aspects. So what is the nasopharyngeal tonsil? Next is pharyngeal bursa, or pouch of Luschka. So it is nothing but, as I told you, it is lined by the mucous membrane. So sometimes this mucous membrane might actually extend into this lymphoid tissue, forming a mucus outpocketing, that is actually called as the pharyngeal bursa. Okay, so it is at this place developmentally. It is at this place developmentally where your notochord was previously attached. Okay, so that place represents this mucus outpocketing. Okay, with the posterior or dorsal surface of the pharynx where the notochord is present, was present previously during the development. Then occasionally you also come across tissue, glandular tissue, which is identical to the adenohypophysis. That is because you know the development of the pituitary gland. It has got two parts: the neurophysis, hypophysis, and the adenohypophysis. So the adenohypophysis is actually, what happens is an outgrowth from the roof of the mouth, or the stomodium. Your primitive mouth is called as the stomodium. From the roof of the mouth, the Rathke's pouch actually ascends upwards to meet the neurohypophysis in this hypophyseal fossa. Okay, so neurohypophysis is actually downward elongation of your diencephalon. So all these I have discussed in detail in your the pituitary gland class. Okay, so on its way, sometimes what happens is these glandular tissue might get deposited in the wall of the pharynx, especially in the roof of the pharynx. So that is where you come across pharyngeal hypophysis. So this is not always present, but occasionally it can be seen. Okay, so next coming to the features on the lateral wall of the nasopharynx. So what are all the features you can appreciate in the lateral wall of the nasopharynx? So opening of the auditory tube. So the pharyngeal opening of the auditory tube, which is situated 1.25 centimeters behind and above the nasal, the posterior nasal aperture. So just posterior, 1.25 centimeters posterior, you can see the opening of the auditory tube, somewhat triangular in nature, and the other end opens into the middle ear cavity or the tympanic cavity. So mainly this function of the auditory tube is to equalize the pressure on either sides of the tympanic membrane. Okay, so that is the main function of the auditory tube. Okay, now this opening is actually guarded by a raised fold, mainly posterior superiorly you are able to see this fold, that is actually called as the tubal elevation. Okay, tubal elevation, because this part of the tube is actually cartilaginous. Okay, and it is guarded by the tubal elevation. Then on the tubal elevation you will be, okay, that is the tubal elevation, you are able to see the opening of the auditory tube. Okay, and you are able to see the folds extending from the tubal elevation below. So two mucous folds you can see. Then on the tubal elevation mainly you come across again aggregation of lymphoid tissue, which is actually called as the tubal tonsil. So this is again a defensive mechanism, because any infections, it is actually there to trap any microorganisms before entering the auditory tube. Because through the auditory tube, what happens, the infections might actually enter into your middle ear cavity, and it might also spread to the middle ear cavity. So to prevent that, but not always it is preventive, but sometimes certain microorganisms might actually infections might enter into the auditory tube and infect your middle ear cavity. Then, so as I told you, tubal elevation, you are able to see opening of auditory tube, the tubal elevation, and the aggregation of lymphoid tissue over the tubal elevation, which is called as the tubal tonsil. So next, what you see is the mucous fold. Two mucous folds mainly you come across, one of which is actually called as the salpingopharyngeus fold, because salpinx means tubular. Since it is arising from the tubular opening, it is actually called as the salpingopharyngeus fold. This fold extends downwards, and deep to that fold, mucous fold, you have the salpingopharyngeus muscle, one of the longitudinal muscle of the pharynx. So that will join with the other two muscles, that is the palatopharyngeus and the stylopharyngeus. Okay, so salpingopharyngeus fold. One more fold which actually extends downwards and anteriorly is the salpingopalatine fold. Okay, so these are the two folds you come across the lateral wall of the nasopharynx. So then next, behind the auditory tube and the tubal elevation, you again see a recess, a deep recess of the mucous membrane, which is actually called as the pharyngeal recess or fossa of Rosenmuller. So it is actually called as the fossa of Rosenmuller. Okay, so these are all the features you come across in the roof and the lateral wall of the interior of the nasopharynx. So pharyngeal tonsils, then you come across your pouch of Lushkar, pharyngeal recess, then opening of auditory tube, tubal elevation, tubal tonsil, salpingopharyngeus fold, and behind the tubal elevation you see the pharyngeal recess, which is called as the fossa of Rosenmuller. This is pharyngeal bursa. Then now here what you see is the nasopharyngeal isthmus, or simply the pharyngeal isthmus. So through this narrow communication, the nasopharynx communicates with the oropharynx. So this is mainly formed by the posterior surface of the soft palate near to the lower end, posterior surface of the soft palate, and posteriorly by raised mucous fold, that is called as the Passavant's ridge. So again, Passavant's ridge, its mechanism I have discussed in detail in the palate class. So kindly refer to the palate class for the details on the Pavlov's ridge. So mucous fold is the Pavlov's ridge, and on either side you have the palatopharyngeal fold formed by the palatopharyngeus muscle. So again, when the food enters the posterior part of the tongue during the process of swallowing, it has entered into the oropharynx. So at that time, this isthmus is closed mainly by your soft palate. So by the contraction of the tensor palatine and the levator palatine muscle, the palate becomes tensed, and then this Pavlov's ridge is brought forward, and the palatopharyngeus muscle contracts to bring this two arches of both the sides also to approximate. So thereby the nasopharynx is completely shut off from the oropharynx. So the boundaries, as I told you, the posterior surface of the soft palate, and then behind the Pavlov's ridge, which is again a mucous fold. Deep to that fold, you have some fibers of the palatopharyngeus muscle, and on either side the palatopharyngeal arch. So we have finished with the nasopharynx. Now we will actually pass on to the oropharynx. So oropharynx in front, actually it is communicating with the oral cavity. So when you open your mouth, so posterior wall, what you see here is the wall of the oropharynx. So thereby it is actually communicating with the oral cavity through the oropharyngeal isthmus. The oropharyngeal isthmus, again, it is mainly formed on either side by the palatoglossal arch. Behind nasopharyngeal isthmus, palatopharyngeal arch we have seen. This is palatoglossal arch. It is mainly formed by the palatoglossal arch and mainly by the posterior part of the dorsum of the tongue. Anteriorly, the dorsum of the tongue. Okay, posterior 1/3 of the dorsum of the tongue, palatoglossal arch on either side and above by the soft palate. So again, during deglutition, what happens is once it is swallowed, this palatoglossal arch also approximates. The tongue will go and approximate with the soft palate during deglutition, and these two palatoglossal arch, anterior pillar of Fossus, it is called as the anterior pillar of Fossus, will approximate. So thereby the food does not actually enter into the or regurgitate back into your oral cavity. Okay, so the boundaries, as I told you, in front posterior part of the tongue, above soft palate, or either side the palatoglossal arch that forms the oropharyngeal isthmus. So it prevents the regurgitation of food. Once swallowed food should not actually enter into the oral cavity. So that is why the pharyngeal isthmus, the oropharyngeal isthmus is present. The swallowed food does not or should not enter into the nasopharynx. So that is why the nasopharyngeal isthmus is present. And the swallowed food does not or should not enter into the laryngeal cavity through the inlet. So the inlet also will be closed by the elevation of the larynx. The food has to pass from the oropharynx into the laryngopharynx alone. Okay, so that is the oropharynx, which you have seen anteriorly. It communicates with the oral cavity through the oropharyngeal isthmus. Behind, it is supported by the second C2 vertebra or the axis vertebra, and then the third cervical vertebra C2, C3, and of course in front you have the intervertebral disc, and in front you have the muscles, the paravertebral muscles lined by your the prevertebral fascia. Now, on the lateral wall of this oropharynx, you see aggregation of lymphoid tissue, which is called as the Palatine Tonsils. So, this Palatine Tonsils in common man's term is referred to as the tonsils. So, basically the term tonsil is aggregation of lymphoid tissue which is actually covered by the mucous membrane. So, deep to the mucous membrane, you see lymphoid tissue. So, then one more natural question arises. In the ileum, deep to the lymphoid tissue, also we have aggregation of the lymphoid follicles, which is called as the Peyer's patches. Okay, but here, what happens here? These tonsils mainly they are actually covered by a capsule. So it is situated on the lateral wall of the oropharynx. In the tonsillar fossa. So the tonsillar fossa is bounded in front by the palatoglossal arch, the mucous fold with the muscle deep to it, palatoglossus muscle, and posteriorly it is bound by the palatopharyngeal arch. Okay, so anteriorly palatoglossal arch and posteriorly the palatopharyngeal arch. Apex is by the soft palate where these two arch they meet. Okay, and base is formed by the posterior one third of the tongue. So anteriorly by the palatoglossal arch, posteriorly by the palatopharyngeal arch, and base is mainly formed by the posterior one third of the tongue, and apex is the soft palate where these two arch they meet. So that is the boundaries of the tonsillar fossa where the tonsil is situated. But the tonsil does not restrict itself to that fossa. Definitely it extends beyond it. That is one thing. And there is no exact size for the tonsils. Okay, so it might vary uh, from person to person. Okay, so now the tonsil actually rests on this wall, which is called as the tonsillar bed, the bed of the tonsil, where the lateral surface of the tonsil will rest. So far we have seen the boundaries anterior, posterior, base and apex. So this is actually the tonsillar bed. Mainly what you come across in the tonsillar bed is the paratonsillar veins. Okay, and the bed is mainly formed by the muscle, your superior constrictor muscle. So mainly it will be formed by the superior constrictor muscle, which forms the posterior two-third and to some extent by this palatopharyngeus muscle, and anterior one third superiorly it will be also formed by the styloglossus muscle. Okay, so mainly it is formed, and all this will be lined by a fascia which is called as the pharyngobasilar fascia. So the fascia, so again one more peculiarity here you come across in the pharynx is this muscle, the constrictors and the other muscles, they are lined by a internally by a fascia which is called as the pharyngobasilar fascia. So superior constrictor muscle, as I told you, styloglossus, with its nerve supply entering along within the glossopharyngeal nerve, and to some extent, as I told you, the palatopharyngeus muscle. So coming to the, that is the structures forming the tonsillar bed. Coming to the presenting parts, it has got two surfaces, medial and lateral surface, and it has got two borders, anterior and posterior border, and then you have two ends, the superior end and the inferior end. So medial surface actually projects, bulges into the oropharynx, and it is not regular or smooth, it is irregular. One thing is because the lymphatic follicles which are covered by the mucous membrane. Apart from that, you see numerous small 10 to 12 openings. Okay, these are actually called as the tonsillar pits. These pits open into the groups which are actually called as the tonsillar crypts. So each crypt will be lined by a mucous membrane, and deep to the mucous membrane you will see lymphatic follicles. Okay, so these pits open into the crypts which is actually called as the tonsillar crypts, and one of the tonsillar crypt is very deep and it is actually called as the intratonsillar cleft. Okay, now this intratonsillar cleft, previously it was considered as the supratonsillar fossa, an extension, but now it is actually agreed that this is the remnant of the second pharyngeal pouch. It is a remnant of the second pharyngeal pouch because tonsils develops from the ventral part of the second pharyngeal pouch. So the intratonsillar cleft is a remnant of the second pharyngeal pouch. Then you'd also see some embryological folds, which is the plica triangularis and the plica semicularis, which extends from the lower part and upper part of the palatoglossal arch. But in adults, again, these mucous folds are actually represented by the lymphatic follicles. Okay, so as I told you, it is covered by the mucous membrane, and the lining epithelium is the pseudo-stratified. The lining epithelium is the stratified squamous non-keratinized epithelium, which is the epithelium of the oral cavity. So, as I told you, the nasopharynx is the posterior continuation of the nasal cavity. The oropharynx can also be considered as the posterior extension of the oral cavity. So it has the lining epithelium and functions as such of the oral cavity. So that is about the medial surface, the features of the medial surface: tonsillar pit, scripts, and intratonsillar cleft. The lateral surface. So the lateral surface is actually related to this lateral wall of the pharynx. Okay, so mainly the lateral surface has got a capsule, and external to the capsule. Okay, external to the capsule, it is related mainly again to the pharyngobasilar fascia, and deep to that fascia or external to that fascia, you have the structures forming the tonsillar bed structures. Okay, so mainly I told you the paratonsillar veins are seen, and then these muscles, mainly structures forming the tonsillar bed, that is your superior constrictor, styloglossus muscle, and part of the palatopharyngeus muscle, and more external to it. So here you are able to see the palatine tonsil. Okay, you are able to see the palatine tonsil, and as I told you, lateral surface, you have the paratonsillar vein structures forming the tonsillar bed, and the muscles more laterally. So the muscles mainly will be external to the palatine tonsil: stylopharyngeus muscle, your buccinator muscle with the buccopharyngeal fascia. Okay, with the and stylopharyngeus with the glossopharyngeal nerve, buccopharyngeal fascia, and the artery, facial artery with its branches to the tonsils, ascending palatine artery. All those you can come across on the lateral surface. Medial surface, you see the crypts. Okay, the lateral surface will be related to these branches, mainly the perivascular stalk. Okay, and as I told you, ascending pharyngeal facial artery and the internal carotid artery, mainly the internal carotid artery you come across. That forms the relations of the lateral surface, and more laterally you will come across the posterior belly of digastric also. So anterior border is related to the anterior, that is palatoglossal arch, and posterior border lies deep to the palatopharyngeal arch. Upper end will be related to the soft palate, and lower end it will be continuous with the lingual tonsils. It is related to the lingual tonsils, and again you have a ligament which is called as the suspensory ligament of the tonsil. The tonsil is held in its place. Mainly factors holding the tonsil in its place is by the suspensory ligament and the arteries. Okay, the vascular branches. Okay, they are mainly the structures which are holding the tonsil in its position. So surface marking of the tonsil is 1.25 centimeters from the angle of the mandible. So you just make a point, just around that, what do you call, point 1.25 centimeters in front and above the angle of mandible, that represents your palatine tonsil on the surface. Next, coming to the blood supply of the tonsil. So the tonsil is mainly supplied by various branches which are called as infratonsillar branches, supratonsillar branches, anterior and posterior tonsillar branches. So the main branch is from the infratonsillar branch, which is from the facial artery. So the branches from the facial artery, they supply the tonsil by piercing the superior constrictor muscle, and it is the principal artery of the tonsil. Okay, so the other arteries. Okay, so from the facial artery, infratonsillar branches, then ascending pharyngeal artery. So ascending pharyngeal artery will give branches to the tonsil. They are called retropharyngeal branches. Then ascending palatine artery. So again branch of facial which will give branches to the tonsil. Ascending palatine branch will again give branches to the tonsil. Then greater palatine artery will give supratonsillar branches. Okay, and then you have the branches from the dorsal lingual artery, which is also called as anterior tonsillar branches because it supplies the tonsil from the front. So mainly facial artery, then you have the dorsal lingual artery, which is a branch of lingual artery, then you have the greater palatine artery, ascending pharyngeal artery. Apart from that, you also have ascending palatine branch of the facial artery. So these are all the branches which are mainly supplying the tonsil, and the principal branches is mainly from the tonsillar branches from the facial artery. Veins, paratonsillar veins, which we just saw now on the lateral surface, they drain into the pharyngeal plexus of veins. So lymphatics, so from the tonsil, they mainly drain into the jugulo-digastric nodes, especially one node which is situated between the posterior belly of digastric, internal jugular vein and the common facial vein. In the triangular area, one of the jugulo-digastric nodes is enlarged in the infections of the tonsils, and it is called as the principal node of the tonsil. Next, coming to the nerve supply. So the nerves are mainly the glossopharyngeal nerves. So branches, because this supplies the posterior one-third of the tongue. No, it carries general as well as the taste sensations. The same is also to its branches to the tonsil is supplying the tonsil, that is the glossopharyngeal nerve, general pain sensations or touch sensations, and also your taste sensations, because some taste buds are also present on the palatine tonsil. And other branches from the pterygopalatine ganglion through the lesser palatine nerve also supplies your tonsil. So next we will also have a short explanation about this Valde's ring of lymphoid tissue. So it is actually a ring of lymphoid tissue which is situated at the junction of the nasopharynx and the oropharynx. So that is where your respiratory tract and your gastrointestinal tract, upper part, where they meet. So what are the structures which forms the Valde's ring of lymphoid tissue? So mainly anteriorly you have the lingual tonsils, posterior one third of the tongue. Then laterally you have the main palatine tonsils. Okay. Posteriorly, the roof of the nasopharynx, you have the nasopharyngeal tonsils, and posterolaterally you have the tubal tonsils. Okay. So anteriorly, what we saw is the lingual tonsil. Here, what we saw is the nasopharyngeal tonsil, and laterally you see the palatine tonsil, and posterolaterally around the tubal elevation we saw the tubal tonsil. So mainly it is actually defending against the microorganisms. So whatever you breathe in has to pass through this, whatever you eat or drink has to pass through this. So naturally it helps to traps the microorganisms. So that is why you have a Walde's ring of lymphatic tissue. So your palatine tonsil itself is a component of the Walde's ring of lymphoid tissue. So coming to the clinical aspects, so inflammation of the tonsil is actually called as the tonsillitis. So mainly what happens, it helps to trap the microorganisms. So it itself might get inflamed due to infections. So naturally it might be bacterial or viral infections, and naturally it gets enlarged and it is reddish in nature. Okay, so that is actually called as the tonsillitis. So the tonsillitis might actually, what happens, it might also spread to the pharynx as pharyngitis. So what is peritonsillar abscess? If this tonsillitis is not treated properly and it is left for a long time, then naturally you can see pus getting collected, and it is enlarged very much, actually pushing your soft palate or uvula to one side. This is called as peritonsillar abscess. So this is a bit serious condition, because if it is left again treated, naturally what happens is the infections might actually spread into your respiratory tract. Okay, and it might produce further complications, or it might obstruct your breathing also. So one thing is, if the tonsil is recurrently getting infected, then that is also causing other problems. Like from there, the infections are spreading to the auditory tube, causing otitis media, and because of that, it is advised to go for tonsillectomy or removal of tonsils. So, in the removal of tonsil, you should be careful whether, if you have ruptured the paratonsillar vein, it will cause excess hemorrhage, and you should actually check for any blood clots following the tonsillectomy, or any hemorrhage is there. First 24 hours after tonsillectomy might occur, then you should try to manage it, or after 24 hours if actually occurs, then you should actually try to arrest the hemorrhage, and also check for any blood clots. Okay, then pain in the tonsil is also referred to the middle ear, because glossopharyngeal nerve. So because the glossopharyngeal nerve also supplies the middle ear as well as the tonsil, so referred pain is felt in the middle ear. With respect to the nasopharynx, so enlargement of this nasopharyngeal tonsil is actually called as the adenoids, most commonly seen in the children. Okay, so this adenoids, what happens is, will lead to other complications, mainly adenoid faces. So you're able to see the face is oblong. It is actually called as adenoid-like faces, and the mouth is always open because the nasal passage is blocked. So nasal breathing is not possible. Oral breathing, the person is actually breathes to the mouth, and during his sleep you can see him snoring. These are all the features of the nasopharynx. And craniofacial ball alignment, because what happens, since the bones are actually in growing phase, and the teeth, all those things, some ball formations, there are chances of ball formations can takes place, and more seriously, sleep apnea. Okay, so sudden loss of breathlessness might takes place because of the sleep apnea obstruction. Okay, so infections from the pharynx might spread actually to the auditory tube by this tubal opening. Okay, and if the tympanic membrane is retracted, then what happens is, through the tubal opening, a catheter is introduced to inflate, to pass air. Thereby, what happens? The retracted tympanic membrane can be brought to its original position, and the tubal elevation around that opening serves as a guide to introduce the catheter. So, and one more thing is pharyngeal, actually, bursa, which we have seen, which is the outpocketing. Sometimes the mucus glands might get obstructed, and it might also produce cystic swellings. Okay, so these are all the clinical aspects of the nasopharynx. Thank you very much, and we will continue with the pharynx in the next class.